Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. And may the peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be upon you. Um, we've engineered physical armor for almost every conceivable threat on Earth. Like if you're going into a combat zone, you wear a Kevlar vest to stop a bullet.
Right.
If you're walking into a burning building, you wear a fire retardant suit.
Right.
And if we zoom all the way down to the microscopic level, we have hazmat suits and N95 masks to filter out invisible pathogens. Our modern world is just completely obsessed with building tangible physical barriers to keep us safe.
Yeah, we really cling to this illusion of control, don't we?
Exactly. But, I mean, what happens when the attack isn't physical? What happens when the threat you're facing is, say, the sudden collapse of your own psychological stability at 3 in the morning?
Or, the unseen toxic malice of a coworker who is actively trying to destroy your reputation.
Right. Or simply that crushing, paralyzing existential dread that no Kevlar vest could ever possibly stop.
Because you realize very quickly that physical armor is actually incredibly superficial. I mean, we lock our deadbolts at night and turn on our security systems, but true human vulnerability is waking up to the terrifying reality of just how much of the universe, both the physical forces of nature and the unseen spiritual realms, operates entirely outside of our jurisdiction.
Which brings us perfectly to the core mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring a comprehensive exegetical analysis, a tafsir of Surah Al Falaq. For those familiar, you know this is the 113th chapter of the Quran. And our goal today is to journey through this remarkably brief text. I mean, it's only 5 verses long.
Right, it's incredibly short.
Yeah, but from the first syllable to the last, we are going to extract profound, deeply practical life lessons. We're looking at how these 5 verses function as a holistic, comprehensive manual for human resilience against, well, basically every form of vulnerability.
And we're approaching this by looking at a true synthesis of thought. Rather than just walking through a dry historical timeline, we're taking the foundational, rigorous frameworks built by classical titans of Islamic scholarship and, mapping them directly onto modern psychological and sociopolitical realities.
So taking the ancient and applying it to right now.
Exactly. We're looking at how a 14th century analytical mind like Ibn Taymiyyah or a massive historian like Ibn Kathir viewed these verses, and then we're overlaying that with the contemporary observations of scholars like Sayyid Qutb, Maududi, Numan Ali Khan, and Omar Suleiman.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, we're really bridging the ancient, vast desert of 7th century Arabia with the complex, hyper-connected, and honestly deeply anxious reality of the modern world.
I love that. So let's start with the architecture of the Quran itself, because, and I think this is so cool, you can't really understand a fortress until you look at where it was built. Surah Al Falaq isn't just dropped randomly in the middle of the text. It's part of the very specific, inseparable pair.
It really is. It's the first half of a definitive conclusion. So Surah Al Falaq is the 113th chapter, and it's immediately followed by Surah An-Nas, which is the 114th and final chapter of the Quran. And in the Islamic intellectual tradition, these two chapters are actually bound together under a single title.
Right, the Al-Mu'awwidhatayn.
Exactly, Al-Mu'awwidhatayn. That translates to the 2 chapters of refuge, and they're positioned at the absolute end of the Quranic corpus for a deeply symbolic reason. I mean, think about the journey of a reader traversing the Quran.
You've gone through a lot to get there.
You really have. You've just waded through this vast ocean of divine revelation. You've encountered intricate legal codes, sweeping narratives of ancient prophets, profound theological arguments, and terrifying eschatological descriptions of the Day of Judgment. You've built this massive spiritual worldview.
And then, boom, the end.
Right. At the very end, the Quran seals all of that knowledge with these 2 chapters. They serve as a final, impenetrable shield designed to protect everything you just learned. They guard the believer's core faith, their tawhid, or strict monotheism, and their overall psychological well-being.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I was reading through the insights from the classical scholar Imam Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali in our sources, and he points out this brilliant functional dichotomy between the 2 chapters. They don't actually do the same job.
No, they handle 2 very different parameters.
Yeah. So Surah Al Falaq, the chapter we are diving into today, deals almost exclusively with external calamities. It's your shield against the terrors of the outside world that you have absolutely no control over. Like we're talking about the darkness of nightfall, erratic weather, infectious diseases, the malicious plots of sorcerers, and the toxic envy radiating from other people.
All the stuff hitting you from the outside.
Exactly. But Surah An-Nas, the very last chapter, turns the shield entirely inward. It addresses internal evils, specifically the whispering of Satan that attacks the human ego and tempts the heart towards sin.
And that distinction between the external perimeter and internal security is just paramount to understanding the Islamic view of harm. Ibn Rajab notes a crucial difference in accountability here.
Okay, how so?
Well, let's say you fall victim to an external affliction. A thief breaks into your home and steals your life savings, or you contract a severe physical illness. You suffer massive worldly harm, right?
Right. Genuine grief, physical pain, financial ruin.
Yes. But you are not ultimately accountable before God for the harm that was inflicted upon you by outside forces. Your soul is intact.
Ah, I see.
However, with the internal evil addressed in Surah An-Nas, the insidious whispering that convinces you to actively commit a sin, to lie, to cheat, to abandon your faith, you are held accountable. The internal evil threatens your eternal spiritual standing, whereas the external evil only threatens your temporary worldly comfort.
Wow. And, let's look at the mathematical structure of this, because Nouman Ali Khan points out something in the text that honestly blew my mind. There is this palpable, mathematically quantifiable desperation when the Quran addresses the internal threat.
The ratio of divine names to threats?
Yes. If you read Surah An-Nas, which is fighting off just one internal evil, that whispering of Satan, the believers is instructed to invoke 3 distinct names or attributes of Allah. You call upon the Lord of mankind, the sovereign of mankind, and the God of mankind. 3 massive divine titles deployed against one single internal threat.
Right.
But in Surah Al Falaq, you invoke only one name of Allah, the Lord of the daybreak, to fight off 4 terrifying, massive external evils. So, it raises this huge philosophical question. Does the Quran consider the loss of our internal moral compass to be that much more catastrophic than any physical harm the world can throw at us?
The structure is visually and linguistically screaming that exact point. Yes. The corruption of your internal moral and spiritual compass is a vastly greater catastrophe than poverty, disease, black magic, or the physical malice of your worst enemies.
Because the soul is permanent.
Exactly. You can lose absolutely everything in the external physical world. You can lose your health, your wealth, your status, your home, and you can still arrive on the day of judgment spiritually victorious. Your eternal trajectory is completely safe.
But if you lose your internal faith?
If you succumb to those internal whispers and your soul rots from the inside out, then all the external protections in the world mean absolutely nothing. Having a healthy body and a full bank account is utterly useless if the soul is dead.
That is heavy.
It is. But that being said, we still have to survive the brutality of the external world while we are here. And that is exactly why Surah Al Falaq is so meticulously detailed in categorizing those outside threats.
Okay, before we get into those specific, terrifying categories of external threats, our sources detail this massive historical mystery surrounding this surah. And it really completely changes the lens through which you read the text. There's this fierce debate among the classical heavyweights about the Asbab al-Nuzul, the occasions of revelation. Did this chapter come down in Makkah, or did it come down years later in Medina?
And determining that geographical and chronological origin isn't just academic trivia, it fundamentally shifts how we understand the primary application of these words by the early Muslims.
Okay, so let's walk through the 2 sides.
Well, you have one major camp of classical scholars, including figures like Hassan al-Basri and Ikrimah, whose position is heavily championed in modern times by Sayyid Abu al-Maududi. They strongly argue that this is a Makki or Meccan revelation,
which places it in the earliest, most dangerous period of Islamic history. Like, the early Muslims in Makkah were a severely persecuted minority. They were facing physical torture, crushing economic boycotts, and constant daily threats of assassination from the polytheistic Quraysh tribe.
Exactly. And Maududi makes a very compelling literary and socio-political argument. He looks at the majestic, poetic style of the surah, the incredibly concise linguistic structure, and the broad, sweeping metaphors, and he says this perfectly matches the early Meccan verses.
It reads like a general, desperate prayer.
Right. A prayer for a deeply vulnerable community pleading for universal protection from an oppressive society. In fact, Maududi warns that if we tie the surah exclusively to a single, later incident in Medina, we risk shrinking its universal power.
You make it about one specific event instead of a timeless shield for persecuted people everywhere.
Exactly. It's a robust argument. But then you have an equally heavyweight opposing camp. Scholars like Qatada, Jalal al-Din al-Suyuti, and the great historian Ibn Kathir argue unequivocally that it is a Madani or Medinan revelation.
And their methodology is different, right?
Yeah, it relies less on literary style and more on rigorously authenticated hadith, the recorded traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. They point to a highly specific, honestly very controversial incident that occurred in Medina around the 7th year after the Hijra.
The bewitchment.
Yes, the actual bewitchment of the prophet, because verse 4 of Surah Al Falaq explicitly mentions seeking refuge from those who blow on knots. And as we'll see, that was the exact literal method of sorcery deployed in this historical event.
Man, the narrative of this bewitchment incident is genuinely startling. It sounds like a supernatural thriller, but it's the trigger point for one of the biggest theological debates in Islamic history. Let's lay out the facts as the sources present them.
Let's do it.
Okay, so the year is 7 AH. The Muslims are established in Medina. There is a man named Labid bin Asam. He somehow manages to acquire some of the Prophet Muhammad's hair, presumably from a comb. He takes this biological material, combines it with the pollen of a male date palm, and uses it to cast a dark spell.
A very specific kind of spell.
Yeah, the narrations describe him tying knots in a string, blowing his incantations into those knots, and then taking this entire cursed apparatus and hiding it at the bottom of a well called Darwan, wedged beneath a heavy stone. And the terrifying part is, it actually works. The prophet becomes physically sick.
The authentic narrations found in foundational collections like Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim are unflinching in their details. The prophet suffered severe physical distress. He experienced a profound lethargy, a wasting physical illness, and he began to suffer from a highly specific, mundane psychological illusion.
A kind of illusion.
He would imagine that he had done simple, everyday household chores like visiting his wives or sweeping the floor that he hadn't actually done. He was essentially trapped in a severe, magically induced fever dream.
Okay, I have to pause and push back on this because this is the exact friction point the sources highlight. The theological implications here seem incredibly messy.
Oh, absolutely.
If the prophet is the messenger of God, chosen by the Creator and granted absolute divine protection to deliver a message, how could he possibly fall victim to a spell cast by a local sorcerer? Doesn't accepting the reality of this bewitchment validate the very insults his enemies were hurling at him?
That's the big question.
Right, because the Quran itself, over in Surah Al Furqan, mentions the polytheists, mocking him, literally calling him a bewitched man whose mind is compromised. If this well incident actually happened, aren't his enemies somewhat vindicated?
You are stepping into the massive historical controversy of Isma, the theological doctrine of prophetic infallibility and divine protection. The questions you're raising are the exact questions that fractured early Islamic theologians.
Really? How so?
Well, the Mutazilites, a very prominent rationalist theological sect, looked at this incident and completely rejected it. They examined the chains of transmission, saw that they were authentic by traditional standards, and essentially said, we don't care about the chain of narrators. Rationally, this contradicts the Quran.
Because God promised to protect them.
Exactly. They argued that if black magic can bypass that protection and affect his mind, then the divine protection failed. So to them, the story must be fabricated. And you'll find modern rationalist commentators today who still hold this view. They find the idea of a prophet succumbing to a spell to be deeply incompatible with divine chosenness.
But the Orthodox Sunni consensus takes a completely different path. They don't throw the story out at all, do they?
Far from it. The overwhelming majority of classical as Sunnah scholars, intellectual giants like Al-Dahabi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Kathir, and Al-Qurtubi firmly affirm the incident's historical and theological validity.
How they justify keeping it.
Al-Dahabi, in his massive biographical encyclopedia, is particularly fierce about this. He argues that if you start throwing out rigorously authenticated historical reports simply because your modern rationalist sensibilities are uncomfortable with the philosophical implications, you destroy the entire objective methodology of preserving history.
You can't just edit the past to fit your theological comfort zone.
Precisely.
So how do the Orthodox scholars resolve the obvious contradiction then? How do they maintain that he is perfectly protected by God while acknowledging he was sickened by a sorcerer's spell?
They resolve it by drawing a razor-sharp, uncompromising line between his physical human biology and his divine prophetic office. They clarify that the magic only caused a temporary, localized physical illness.
Okay, so it didn't touch his mind in a prophetic sense.
Right. Think of it like a severe migraine, a high fever, or a physical laceration he might sustain from a sword on a battlefield. It attacked his nervous system, it affected his body, and caused a mild, mundane forgetfulness regarding his daily household routine.
Like thinking he swept the floor when he didn't.
Exactly. But, and this is the absolute crux of the Orthodox argument that saves the theology, the spell never touched his soul. It never compromised his memory of a single syllable of the Quran. It never altered his delivery of the divine revelation, and it never impacted his legal rulings.
Wow, okay.
His spiritual integrity and his capacity to function as the messenger of God were perfectly divinely quarantined from the illness. The black magic could bruise the human flesh, but it could not pierce the divine mission.
That is a brilliant distinction. And the life lesson the classical scholars extract from this biological vulnerability is incredibly grounding. Prophets are not demigods. They are biologically human. They bleed, they get fevers, they feel physical pain, and yes, they are susceptible to the unseen harms and illnesses of the world, just like any other human being. Acknowledging our human fragility, acknowledging that even the absolute greatest of mankind could fall physically ill from an unseen, malicious attack, is the fundamental prerequisite for true reliance on God.
Because if you walk around thinking you're invincible, you will never seek refuge. You only seek a shield when you know your skin can be pierced.
Exactly. So how does this bewitchment incident end? Because it provides the perfect bridge to synthesize that Makki versus Madani debate we discussed earlier.
It does. So while the prophet was suffering from this wasting illness, the narrations state that the angel Jibril Gabriel descended, and this leads to the dual revelation theory. It suggests that Surah Al Falaq and Surah An-Nas may very well have been initially revealed years earlier in Makkah, acting as that general sweeping prayer Maududi talked about.
But now they're being used as a targeted cure.
Yes. During this specific crisis in Medina, Jibril prescribed them again as a highly targeted, specific medical and spiritual cure. The prophet was instructed to recite the surahs, and the text described a miraculous physical reaction.
What happened?
With every single verse he recited, one of the knots Labid bin Asam had tied in the well untied itself. When the final verse was spoken, the spell shattered completely, and the prophet's physical vitality was instantly and completely restored.
Oh, wow. The visual of the spoken words physically unraveling unseen knots is just stunning. It shows the sheer mechanical power of the text. So let's explore how this mechanism of seeking refuge actually operates on a spiritual level. Our sources introduce the Arabic term istiadha, which is the theology and philosophy of seeking refuge.
Yes, and Imam Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya breaks this concept down brilliantly. He explains that seeking refuge is not a passive emotion. You don't just sit there and feel safe. It requires two simultaneous, highly active movements.
It's an action.
It's a very dynamic action. First, you must recognize a perceived terror or danger and actively flee from it. Your heart has to run away from the threat. Second, you must be sprinting at full speed toward an invincible sanctuary that actually possesses the power to protect you.
So it's entirely based on motion.
Yeah.
You're spiritually relocating yourself from a zone of extreme vulnerability to an impenetrable fortress. And this active dynamic nature is perfectly encapsulated in the very first word of the surah, qul, which translates to say.
Notice it doesn't command the believer to think about refuge or feel peaceful. It commands them to say.
Right, because vocalization changes the psychological reality of the speaker. It's a proactive, conscious declaration.
By speaking the words aloud, you align your physical tongue, your internal psychological state, and your spiritual intention. You are actively forcing the anxiety, the paranoia, and the paralyzing superstition out of your heart and replacing it with an articulated submission to the only entity that controls the outcome. You take control of your panic by verbalizing who is actually in charge.
Let's look at the exact phrase we're commanded to say. Verse 1, say, I seek refuge with the Lord of the daybreak. In Arabic, Qul Agu, by Surah Al Falaq. Now, because classical Arabic is a root-based language, we have to do a linguistic deep dive into that word falaq. The root is surprisingly violent, isn't it?
It's a very explosive word. The root of falaq primarily means to split, to cleave, or to burst forth violently. And because Arabic is so phenomenally rich, the classical exegetical tradition presents a massive tapestry of interpretations for this single word. Scholars didn't just pick one meaning, they looked at the word and saw different facets of a single diamond.
So what's the most universally accepted interpretation?
The standard one, championed by early authorities like Ibn Abbas, Mujahid, and later Ibn Kathir, is that falaq simply means the daybreak or the dawn.
Which perfectly aligns with the root meaning. The dawn is the physical splitting of the oppressive, suffocating darkness of the night.
Exactly. It represents Allah's immense, unstoppable cosmic power. Think about the inevitability of the dawn. No matter how incredibly long, freezing, or terrifying the night is, the dawn always inevitably cleaves it open. It is a daily visual proof of God's dominance over darkness.
But scholars like Said Qutbi and Maududi pull back the lens even further, right? They look at the root to burst forth and ask, what else bursts forth?
And their answer is, the entirety of creation, every single living thing in the universe bursts forth from something else. A fragile green plant violently splits the hard, compacted soil to reach the sunlight. A fresh spring of water cleaves through solid stone. A new biological life splits the womb.
Wow.
Therefore, they argue, seeking refuge in the Lord of the Falaq is seeking refuge in the Lord of all existence, the ultimate initiator of life who brings existence out of the void.
It expands the sanctuary to the edges of the universe. Now, the sources also note some highly specific minority opinions, just to show the breadth of classical thought. For instance, al-Tabari cites older opinions suggesting Falaq refers to a specific, terrifying, covered pit or a shadowed valley deep within the hellfire.
But heavyweights like Ibn Taymiyyah strongly critique this view.
Why? It seems valid linguistically.
He argues against it using contextual logic. He points out that the believer is currently panicked, seeking comfort and sanctuary from earthly fears. There is zero theological wisdom or psychological comfort in invoking Allah exclusively as the Lord of a torture pit in hell in the exact moment you are begging for safety.
That makes total sense. You want to run toward the light. You don't want to be reminded of a darker pit.
Right. The connotation of the magnificent light-bringing dawn or the miraculous beauty of creation bursting forth aligns much better with the psychology of a Lord providing a safe, warm sanctuary.
And then we have the great philosopher-theologian Fakhr al-Din al-Razi. He provides this incredibly nuanced structural metaphor.
Al-Razi always loved the philosophical architecture of the text.
Yeah, he posits that Falaq, the split or the cleft, represents the deep, safe valley situated between two towering, dangerous mountains. He uses this as a metaphor for the path of moderation. Seeking refuge in the Lord of the Falaq is asking God to keep you safely in the valley, on the straight path, Sirat al-Mustaqim, protecting you from climbing up into the extreme, radical deviations on either side that inevitably lead to societal and spiritual ruin.
But whether you lean toward the interpretation of the dawn, the bursting forth of all creation, or the middle path, the psychological application for the listener remains profoundly consistent. Contemporary speakers like Abu Amar Yasir Qadi and Numan Ali Khan anchor this beautifully for the modern mind.
I love the analogy they use here. Imagine you are standing in a pitch-black room. You are terrified of what might be lurking in the corners. You don't stand there and try to punch the darkness.
You can't wrestle shadows to the ground.
Exactly. You just reach over to the wall and turn on the light switch. The darkness vanishes instantly, completely, because darkness has no actual substance. It is merely the absence of light. That is the psychological anchor of verse 1. If the Creator can effortlessly tear through the absolute infinite cosmic blackness of the universe to bring the morning sun every single day without fail, He can easily, effortlessly tear through your personal crisis.
He can split your systemic oppression. He can shatter your clinical depression.
It triggers a total paradigm shift in the believer. It shifts you away from anxious self-reliance, the exhausting belief that you have to single-handedly fight the darkness, and moves you to an absolute, unwavering trust in divine capability. You are invoking the Lord of the Dawn to manually bring a dawn to your specific, localized nightmare.
And if we accept that the Creator can effortlessly split the cosmic darkness, the natural next question is, what exact darkness are we running from?
Right, because the world isn't just dark, it's actively hostile. That brings us to the blanket acknowledgement in verse 2. From the evil of whatever He has created. Min shari ma khalaq. This is a massive, sweeping statement. It leaves absolutely nothing out. It covers human tyrants, unseen jinn, wild beasts, catastrophic weather events, and microscopic airborne pathogens.
It is the ultimate perimeter defense. You are asking for a general, all-encompassing shield against the potential harm embedded in the entirety of the physical universe.
But this verse forces us to confront a massive philosophical roadblock. It's a question that stops a lot of people in their tracks and causes crises of faith. If God is entirely good, entirely merciful, and entirely perfect, why does He create evil?
The oldest question in the book.
Yeah, how does this verse, from the evil of whatever He has created, reconcile with divine perfection? If God consciously created a pathogen, or a venomous snake, or malicious human, and those things cause evil, doesn't that reflect poorly on the character of the Creator?
You have just articulated the problem of evil, known in formal philosophy and theology as theodicy. And the sources detail how Fakhr al-Din al-Razi utterly deconstructs this dilemma in his monumental Tafsir al-Kabir. He establishes a fundamental, undeniable framework for reality. Evil, as we humans experience it, exists strictly in the sublunar world.
The sublunar world.
That is the physical, earthly realm of generation, growth, decay, and corruption involving physical bodies and substances. God creates the vast laws of nature. He creates physical substances. He grants humans free will. The friction between these natural laws, or the conscious misuse of human free will, is what generates the phenomenon we experience and label as evil.
So it's not a standalone force. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya refines this even further, right? He argues that shar, the Arabic word for evil, is not some independent, autonomous, metaphysical entity floating in the ether, acting as a rival power to God.
No, not at all.
Shar is simply the direct human experience of pain, loss, and suffering, or the specific factors that trigger that affliction. Numan Ali Khan brings in that brilliant linguistic nuance again, noting that shar is essentially just the absence of good.
Just like darkness is the absence of light and cold is the absence of heat, evil is what happens when goodness, justice, or divine harmony is temporarily absent or corrupted by a created being.
Furthermore, by explicitly stating from the evil of what he created, the Quran establishes a profound, deeply grounding truth about reality that cures naive utopian thinking.
Yes. No creation is inherently flawless. Absolutely nothing in the created universe is perfect. Only the Creator is absolute perfection.
That distinction is vital. Everything created has a dual nature. It carries an inherent potential for harm simply because it is not God. The sun provides the essential warmth and light we need to survive, but if you are exposed to it too long, it will give you severe burns or cancer.
Water is the literal, undeniable source of all biological life on the planet, but if you inhale it, it will drown you in seconds. Fire cooks our food and warms our homes, but it can burn an entire city to ash.
Every single created thing, by virtue of its physical limitations, contains the inherent potential for shar.
Sayyid Qutb, in his seminal exegesis Faisal al-Quran, expands this into a beautiful macrocosmic lens. He views the entire universe as operating under a massive, perfectly harmonious divine law. The planets orbit in precision, the tides pull with the moon, the seasons change in order. The physical universe is utterly obedient.
Humans aren't.
Exactly. When humans or any aspect of nature deviate from that divine law through corruption, arrogance, sorcery, envy, or malice, they create this miserable, grinding friction. They generate suffering. Therefore, seeking refuge with this verse is essentially a human being attempting to realign themselves with the universal harmony of their creator. You are asking to be shielded from the unnatural divergence of evil souls and the inherent physical dangers of a flawed, volatile, natural world.
So what is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener here? It is the total, unflinching acknowledgement of reality. The Islamic worldview does not peddle blind, toxic positivity. It does not promise a utopia in this life. It openly, explicitly acknowledges that danger, pain, malice, and systemic unfairness exist within the fabric of the universe. The Quran isn't telling you to close your eyes and pretend everything is fine.
It acknowledges the terror, but it immediately contextualizes the fear. It teaches the believer not to paralyze themselves with paranoia. If you spent your days hyperfixating on the myriad ways your body could biologically fail, or the chance a drunk driver could hit you, or the mathematical probability of a microscopic virus infecting you, you would literally never leave your house.
You'd be paralyzed.
Instead of fearing the terrifying scope of creation, you seek refuge in the creator of those things. The underlying logic is absolute and impenetrable. The architect is always, always dominant over his architecture.
That is such a stabilizing thought. No created thing, not a mutating cell, not a Category 5 storm, not a powerful political enemy, possesses the independent, autonomous power to harm a believer if the creator decides to provide sanctuary. The architect controls the architecture.
Precisely.
So we've set this massive universal perimeter with verse 2. It covers literally everything. Now the surah structurally shifts. It zooms in from the general universe to 3 highly specific, acute, historically terrifying dangers. We move to verse 3. And from the evil of the darkness when it settles. وَمِن شَرِّ غَاسِقٍ إِذَا وَقَبَ.
This verse forces us to confront one of the most primal, universal human fears, the night. But linguistically, the terms Ghasik and Waqab have generated highly specific, fascinating debates among classical linguists.
Let's break those words down because they paint a very specific picture.
So, the standard translation, strongly supported by early linguistic authorities like Mujahid and Al-Tabari, focuses on the intense, suffocating darkness of the night as it fully envelops the earth. Gasik literally implies something pouring out or darkening rapidly, like a bottle of dark ink spilling across the sky.
Okay.
And Waqab refers to the act of entering into, settling deeply, or becoming entirely oppressively pitch black. This isn't the pleasant twilight of early evening. It is the dead, blinding, isolating dark of midnight.
But the sources also point to other interpretations based on the historical context, specifically regarding the moon, right?
Yes, there is a very prominent, authentic hadith narrated by the Prophet's wife, Aisha. She records that one night, the Prophet pointed up at the moon as it was setting or being covered in darkness, and he instructed her directly, seek Allah's refuge from this gasik when it sets.
So the moon itself is the Gasik.
Well, classical scholars like Fakhr al-Din al-Razi and Ibn al-Qayyim analyzed this and noted a sociological reality. When the moon is absent or during an eclipse or a new moon, it creates the absolute pitch black conditions that are highly preferred by criminals. It is the optimal cover for sorcerers to cast spells, for thieves to raid homes, and for malicious entities to operate unseen. The physical moon itself isn't evil, but its absence unleashes the evil of the dark.
There is also a bit of fascinating pre-Islamic Arabian folklore tied to this regarding the Pleiades star cluster.
That is a brilliant anthropological detail the classical linguists preserved. In pre-Islamic Arabia, the desert culture occasionally linked the term Gosik to the setting of the Pleiades star cluster, which they called Al-Thuraya.
What happened when it set?
When this specific star cluster set at a certain time of year, it historically correlated with the onset of intense, brutal summer heat, the arrival of crop-destroying agricultural pests, and waves of seasonal illnesses. So, there was a deeply ingrained cultural memory of seeking protection when those stars set. However, while linguists dutifully note this history, the synthesized Sunni consensus embraces the broader, more universal reality. Gesik refers to the terrifying, concealing absence of light whenever and however it occurs.
Logically, we completely understand why ancient people feared the night. There were no streetlights in 7th century Arabia. Predators, venomous snakes, rival tribes, bandits, they all used the darkness as a tactical advantage. But let's bring this to the present. Most of us listening to this deep dive live in electrified modern cities. We can flood our homes with light at 2 a.m. with the flick of a switch. We don't worry about a pack of wolves attacking our living rooms. So what makes the night uniquely terrifying for us today?
This is where the profound psychological insights of modern scholars like Omar Suleiman and Said Abu al-Maududi become so critical. They shift the lens from physical danger in the desert to psychological vulnerability in the modern bedroom. Why highlight the night? Because the night is when human isolation peaks.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. During the day, you are endlessly distracted. You have your job, you have traffic, you have conversations, you have the constant noise of the world buffering your thoughts. But when the night settles at the Waqab, the world goes completely quiet, the distractions fall away, and you are left entirely alone with your own mind.
It's the modern epidemic of 3 a.m. doom scrolling. It's laying awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the compounding weight of your entire life pressing down on your chest. It's not just the physical dark of the room that's scary, it's the feeling of total opacity regarding your life path. You can't see your future. You can't see the way out of your mounting debt, or your failing relationship, or the grief of losing someone. The night magnifies hopelessness.
That is the exact modern manifestation of the Gasik. It is a time when intrusive thoughts, deep-seated anxieties, depressive episodes, and existential dread most fiercely attack the human psyche. The evil of the darkness isn't just about ancient thieves in the night. It represents those terrifying, isolating periods in a human's life when all clarity is lost, when circumstances feel completely opaque, and when loneliness transitions from a passive state into a crushing, suffocating weight.
So the life lesson here is entirely about spiritual and mental hygiene. In those times of extreme isolation, when your environment is dark and your mind is spiraling, you have to artificially generate your own internal light.
Exactly.
The sources emphasize that the believer must use the active remembrance of Allah Dekrit to pierce that psychological darkness. If you are awake at 3 a.m. drowning in anxiety, reciting this specific verse is a way of reminding your panicked nervous system that the Lord of the daybreak is fully capable of bringing the dawn to your mind, just as effortlessly as an inmate. He brings it to the eastern sky.
And moving from the internal isolation of the night, the surah then targets a very specific external mechanism of harm that frequently operates under the cover of that darkness. Verse 4, and from the evil of those who blow on knots, وَمِن شَرِّ النَّفَثَاتِ فِي الْعُقَدِ.
This pulls us right back to the historical incident with Labid bin Assam. This verse directly addresses the clandestine, supernatural, and psychological manipulation executed through sorcery, or sir. Let's look at the linguistics, because the Arabic word al-nafathad is incredibly, almost uncomfortably descriptive.
It refers to the active, repeated blowing accompanied by minor misting spitting. Witches and magicians historically utilized cords or strings, physically tying knots and blowing their dark incantations, their venomous intent, and their saliva into them to spiritually bind a victim in a spell.
And we must reiterate, because modern audiences often struggle with this. Classical exegetes like Al-Qurtubi and Ibn Kathir treat this as a literal, weaponized category of harm. Orthodox Sunni theology firmly and unapologetically acknowledges that black magic, the evil eye, and unseen jinn interference are not just ancient folklore, and they're not merely psychological placebo effects. They are factual, operative realities of the unseen world.
Yes.
But I can hear you, the listener, asking the obvious question here. How does a strict, uncompromisingly monotheistic religion reconcile the power of a local sorcerer with the absolute, unrivaled power of God? Doesn't acknowledging that magic works give independent power to something other than Allah?
That tension is resolved by the theological genius of scholars like Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali. He points out that acknowledging the reality of magic does not compromise Tawhid monotheism in the slightest.
How does he figure?
Because magic only operates strictly within the unyielding bounds of Allah's permissive will, known as irada kawniyya. A sorcerer, no matter how powerful, cannot force a spell to work independently of God's permission. The Quran explicitly states in Surah Al Baqarah, verse 102, that magicians cannot harm anyone except by Allah's leave.
Ah, I see.
Therefore, recognizing the threat of magic actually reinforces your reliance on Allah because you realize that only He holds absolute jurisdiction over the unseen forces deployed by the sorcerer. You don't fear the magician, you fear the one who allows or blocks the magic. The shield is always stronger than the spell.
That makes perfect theological sense. But let's bring it down to earth for a minute. What does this verse mean for someone listening today who isn't actively worrying about literal witches tying knots in their hair? How does a verse about blowing on knots apply to a modern corporate worker navigating office politics or a college student dealing with drama?
Omar Suleiman's analysis here is incredibly vital for the modern reader. He moves beyond the literal and unpacks the profound psychological and sociological metaphors embedded in this verse. Think about the English idiom of having your life tied up in knots. Even if you have never been afflicted by literal black magic, have you ever experienced a season where your life just feels inexplicably tangled?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone has. It's a feeling of bizarre emotional paralysis. You want to move forward in your career, but you inexplicably can't make progress. Your interpersonal relationships, which used to be smooth, suddenly become tangled, contentious, and full of friction for absolutely no logical reason. Everything grinds to a sudden, frustrating halt.
And where does that friction often originate? The blowers and knots serve as a perfect, enduring sociological metaphor for toxic, manipulative people in our daily lives. The people who engage in hidden deceit, the gossipers, the slanderers, the gaslighters. They operate in the social shadows, whispering lies and manipulating perceptions behind the scenes. They act as modern social sorcerers. Through their words, they actively untie the bonds of love, the bonds of a healthy marriage, the bonds of workplace trust, and they replace those healthy connections by secretly tying knots of hatred, suspicion, and confusion between people.
Viewing gossip as a form of social black magic is such a powerful paradigm shift. It alters the victim's reality without the victim even seeing the spell being cast. So the life lesson here is a mandate for extreme social caution. We have to ruthlessly guard ourselves against engaging in backbiting and guard ourselves from those who do.
Absolutely.
And more importantly, when we feel our lives getting inexplicably tangled, we have to realize that we can't always see the knots being tied against us in secret boardrooms or in private group chats or by unseen entities. But invoking the Lord of the Daybreak, the one who splits the darkness, can unravel all of those hidden plots, whether they're supernatural or social.
And that profound realization leads us perfectly to the final verse, which isolates the psychological root, the very catalyst of almost all human-to-human evil. Verse 5, and from the evil of an envier when he envies. وَمِن شَرِّ حَاسِدٍ إِذَا حَسَدَ.
Numan Ali Khan points out the sheer rhetorical brilliance of this entire surah sequence. It operates like a cinematic camera zooming in on a target. We started extremely wide at the macro level, the entirety of all physical creation at verse 2.
Right.
Then the camera zoomed into a specific time and circumstance. the terrifying, isolating night in verse 3. Then zoomed in further to a specific group of dangerous people, the hidden sorcerers and manipulators in verse 4.
Yeah.
And finally, the camera rests on one singular, incredibly destructive individual, the envier in verse 5.
The camera stops there because envy is the ultimate source code of malice. Think about the history we just discussed. Lawaz bin Asam didn't wake up one day and bewitch the prophet out of thin air. He did it out of deep-seated envy. People don't gossip and untie social knots for no reason. They do it out of envy. It is the root disease of the human heart.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But classical scholars are meticulous in differentiating between two very distinct emotional states here, and we have to separate them. You have gibta and you have hasad.
Let's clearly define those, because modern English often conflates jealousy and envy, but they are spiritually very different.
Gibta is often translated as praiseworthy or benign jealousy. It is the feeling you get when you look at someone who has a beautiful blessing. Maybe they have an incredible encyclopedic memory for the Quran, or they are deeply generous with their wealth, or they have a beautiful, peaceful family, and you think, wow, I wish I had that blessing too.
But you don't want them to lose it.
Exactly. That is the critical distinction. You never want that person to lose their blessing. You just want God to elevate you to their level of success. In matters of faith and good deeds, gibta is actually encouraged. It drives healthy competition in righteousness.
But hasad is the dark, rotting side of that emotion.
Hasad is malicious, toxic, corrosive envy. It is a burning, agonizing desire in the heart to see another person violently stripped of their divine blessings. An envier doesn't just want what you have, they want you to lose it, even if they never get it themselves. They just want to see you suffer and fail.
That's so dark.
And this is the exact root of the concept of the evil eye, or al-ain. Scholars like Ibn Kathir and al-Qurtubi tightly link this final verse directly to the evil eye, explaining that it is essentially the metaphysical manifestation of a deeply envious, venomous soul looking upon your blessing with hatred. The intense, concentrated negative energy of that gaze can actually cause physical or material harm, again, solely by Allah's permission.
Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali highlights a terrifying theological rebellion built into hasad. He frequently relates the prophetic hadith that warns, envy eats good deeds just as fire eats wood. Why is it so uniquely spiritually destructive to the person feeling it? Because holding on to hasad is basically a silent, arrogant accusation against the Creator. You are looking at God's divine decree, his qadar, and essentially saying, you made a mistake. You distributed your blessings unfairly. That person doesn't deserve that house, that spouse, that success. I do. You're actively critiquing the wisdom of the ultimate architect.
It destroys your own faith because it breeds constant, agonizing resentment against God. Now, Maududi clarifies a vital legal and spiritual point regarding the specific phrasing used in the Quran here. The verse doesn't just say, from the envier, it says, from the evil of an envier when he envies, ida hasad.
Why add that qualifier?
Because the baseline emotion of envy often lies dormant in the human heart. We all experience flashes of discontent or petty jealousy. It is part of the flawed, insecure human condition. But it only becomes a destructive external evil, the kind you need to seek formal divine refuge from, when the envier takes practical, active steps to harm the target, when that internal feeling crosses the barrier into malicious words, sabotage, or the active projection of the evil eye.
This feels unbelievably relevant today. Think about modern social media architecture. We've literally built an entire global culture around the meticulous oversharing of our successes. We post the heavily filtered vacation photos, the new car purchase, the perfect family portrait, the promotion announcement on LinkedIn.
Yeah, we post everything.
And by doing so, we are indiscriminately broadcasting our blessings to thousands of strangers and acquaintances, inevitably, mathematically inviting the gaze of the hasid, the malicious envier.
We voluntarily subject ourselves to massive spiritual vulnerability for the sake of brief dopamine hits. The practical application of this verse is the lost art of guarding one's blessings. The Islamic tradition teaches that not every blessing needs an audience. Discretion is a profoundly effective form of spiritual protection.
I was reading through Sayyid Abdul Alam Maududi's notes on this, and he provides this incredibly practical 6-part framework for how to deal with a known envier. It reads almost like a spiritual cognitive behavioral therapy manual. Let's say you have a coworker who is actively, toxically envious of you, trying to sabotage your work. What fascinates me about Maududi's framework is that his very first move has absolutely nothing to do with the other person. It's entirely internal. You anchor yourself in God first. It's like putting your own oxygen mask on before dealing with cabin pressure.
That is the genius of the sequence. Before you react, before you plan a counterattack, you rely entirely on Allah. You anchor your heart in the unshakable belief that this envier cannot harm your career or your life unless God permits it, and if God permits it, there is a hidden wisdom or purification in the trial. Your first line of defense is spiritual submission, not tactical retaliation. If you skip that and go straight to confronting the person, you've already lost, because you're fighting on their toxic terms.
And if you don't anchor yourself, you fall right into his next trap, which is paranoia. If you spend your days obsessing over what the envious coworker is doing, checking their social media, trying to figure out what they're saying behind your back, you have voluntarily handed them the keys to your mind. Paranoia breeds immense psychological vulnerability. You have to actively choose to evict them from your mental real estate.
Which leads to his most counterintuitive advice. Responding with overt good character and generosity, when someone projects hidden malice in the office, returning it with overt, confusing kindness short-circuits their strategy. It frustrates the envier because they want a reaction, and it elevates your own spiritual rank. You refuse to let their darkness dictate your light.
That requires so much discipline because the natural human instinct is revenge. We want to get even. But if you obsess over getting back at the envier, your heart becomes infected with the exact same disease they have. You become a mirror of their toxicity. You have to break the cycle by refusing to let vengeance rot your own soul. You have to realize that the envier is already living in their own personal hell. As we discussed, their envy is eating their own good deeds like fire eats wood. They're living in constant, agonizing discontent with God's distribution of blessings. You almost have to pity them rather than fear them because they are actively destroying their own eternal standing.
And Maududi brings it all full circle back to Tawhid, back to monotheism. Ultimate power, ultimate provision, and ultimate protection rest with Allah alone. The envier is just a flawed, powerless, deeply unhappy creation. Keep your eyes on the Creator, and the creation loses its power to terrify you.
It is an incredibly empowering psychological blueprint. It shifts you from being a helpless, paranoid victim to an active participant in your own spiritual resilience. So we've covered the macro philosophy, the intense historical debates, and the deep dive into the meaning of all 5 verses. But a shield is totally useless if it just sits locked in a display case in the armory.
Yeah.
How do we operationalize this text? How do we actually put this into daily practice?
The theoretical and exegetical depth of Surah Al Falaq is matched only by its practical, rigorous, ritualistic mandate in the daily life of a Muslim. The authentic hadith traditions from Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, and Nasai are incredibly precise about how the surah is to be deployed. First, we have to establish its unrivaled rank.
Okay, what do you mean?
The Prophet Muhammad explicitly stated to his companion Uqba bin Amir that no seeker of refuge can seek refuge with anything comparable to Surah Al Falaq and Surah An-Nas. Another companion, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, reported a fascinating detail. The Prophet used to seek refuge from the jinn and the evil eye using various different general supplications. But the very moment the Muawwidhatayn were revealed, he completely dropped everything else and held exclusively to them. They are the ultimate, definitive benchmark of divine protection.
And the sources detail a very specific physical nightly regimen that Aisha recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari. It isn't just a casual recitation before sleep. Every single night, the Prophet would sit in his bed, cup his hands together and recite Surah Al-Ikhlas, Surah Al Falaq, and Surah An-Nas.
Yes, and the next step is key.
Right. Then he would blow into his cupped palms, which is a fascinating physical counteraction to the sorcerer's blowing into knots, and then he would physically wipe his hands over his entire body, starting with his head and face and moving down. And he repeated this exact deliberate ritual 3 times every single night.
We have to look at the mechanism of why this was done. Think about the extreme vulnerability of sleep. You are unconscious, entirely unaware of the physical world, paralyzed, slipping into the realm of the unseen, totally defenseless against the Ghazik, the terrifying dark night. Why start by wiping the head and face?
Because that's where the thoughts are.
Exactly. The head is the seat of the mind, the target of anxiety, illusion, and whispering. The act of blowing into the hands incorporates the physical element of ruqa, spiritual healing, using the moisture and breath carrying the spoken word of God to physically coat the body in an unseen armor. This ritual serves as an impenetrable spiritual quarantine while you sleep.
And it isn't just for the night. The prophetic traditions recommend reciting these surahs 3 times every morning and evening, with the absolute promise that it will suffice you against everything. It is the ultimate preventative medicine.
And curatively, it serves as the primary mechanism for formal ruqya. Following the historical incident of his own bewitchment, the prophet established a permanent precedent that physical illnesses, profound psychological distress, and unseen spiritual afflictions should be met with the recitation of these divine words. Regular recitation doesn't just protect the physical body from harm, it continuously, daily recalibrates and realigns the human heart toward total reliance on the divine.
Let's summarize the massive arc we've just traveled in this deep dive. We started by examining the universal theological architecture of refuge, understanding why these verses seal the Quran. We waded through the fierce historical mystery of Makkah versus Medina, and we tackled the controversial bewitchment of the prophet, learning that acknowledging our own biological fragility is the vital first step to seeking divine strength. We explored the explosive, shattering power of the Lord of the Daybreak in verse 1.
Then we grappled with the profound philosophical problem of evil in verse 2, realizing that creation is inherently flawed and prone to dangerous friction.
We confronted the terrifying, isolating psychological darkness of the night in verse 3. We untangled the supernatural and sociological knots of manipulation and toxic gossip in verse 4. And finally, we isolated the corrosive, spiritually self-destructive venom of the envious eye in verse 5.
And the ultimate conclusion of the surah is this. Surah Al Falaq, despite dealing with genuinely terrifying subjects like black magic, pitch-dark nights, and malicious plotting enemies, is not meant to instill fear in the believer. It is meant to permanently, decisively eradicate it.
Yes.
It demands a total psychological paradigm shift, from a posture of crippling anxiety and vulnerability to a posture of absolute, unshakable security. When you actively, verbally declare your refuge in the Lord of the Daybreak, you are acknowledging that no darkness, not the literal night, not the gloom of unseen magic, not the heavy shadows of clinical depression, and not the toxicity of human envy can withstand the shattering, illuminating power of the Creator.
It is a masterclass in navigating the inherent, unavoidable dangers of human existence. You don't have to be terrified of the flawed architecture of the world when you know the flawless architect. Which brings me to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we conclude today's journey. If this incredibly powerful surah teaches us to seek refuge from the inherent flaws and evils of the created world, it strongly implies that the only truly safe, flawless place to run to is the Creator himself. So ask yourself, what happens to our peace of mind, to our psychological stability, when we mistakenly seek refuge from life's storms and other created things?
That's a profound question.
When we try to find our ultimate safety in our bank accounts, in our fleeting career status, or in the validation of other flawed human beings, knowing that every single created thing has the inherent potential for harm and disappointment, are we actually running toward a sanctuary, or are we just running blindly into another storm?
That is the ultimate defining question of human reliance.
Jazakallah khair. May Allah reward you with goodness for spending your valuable time listening to us.